Well, good evening, and welcome to another episode of All Things About Herbert Hoover and His Times. I'm Tom Schwartz, director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum in West Branch, Iowa. We are one of 13 presidential museums and 15 presidential libraries operated by the National Archives and Records Administration. All good things must come to an end, and this is the final of the third Thursday broadcasts for 2023 and perhaps in the foreseeable future. Tonight, we're pleased to have Professor Herbert Agran as our featured presenter. He is the Professor Emeritus of History, Wilmington College, and a University of Iowa Senior College lecturer. Agran served on the Wilmington College history faculty from 1993 until his retirement in 2016, along with his wife, Professor Charlotte Fairley, in the English department. The pair of docs relocated to Iowa City, where they currently reside. Agran is author of two books, Too Good a Town, William Allen White, Community and the Emerging Rhetoric of Middle America, and Herbert Hoover and the Commodification of Middle-Class America, An American Promise. His talk tonight, Herbert Hoover Promises to Keep. During and at the end of the presentation, viewers are encouraged to submit questions in the chat feature. Please indicate if you are participating courtesy of a public library group. And a special thanks to Aaron Scheinblum, who is the wizard controlling the technology tonight. So, without further moderator interruption, welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I thank you, and I thank the library and the museum staff for all you do to preserve and propagate the Hoover story. And thanks for listening in, whoever you are out there. Herbert Hoover Promises to Keep. My research, as Tom was just speaking about, focuses on the progressive reform era, the late 19th century through the 1920s and into the 1930s. My first book, Too Good a Town, William Allen White, Community and the Emerging Rhetoric of Middle America, traces the ideals of one of the most influential social commentators of the first half of the 20th century. Journalist White worked hard at reform. He expended considerable energy towards shaping the emergent American middle-class standard. All deserve a good life, security, comfort, opportunity. More recently, reading history, Sinclair Lewis, American Identity in the 1920s, under consideration now for publication, examines the middle ground thought of one of the country's great novelists. Sandwiched between the two is my study, Herbert Hoover and the Commodification of Middle-Class America, An American Promise. In short, I focus on the middle landscape of the United States. While Lewis and Hoover believed in the American promise, White, Lewis, and Hoover believed in the American promise. All deserve a fair shake, economic, social, political, and cultural. These early to mid-20th century spokesmen trusted in the American experiment. We never reach perfection. We never halt aiming for it. It's that simple, and throughout our history, it's been that difficult. But we keep at it, and despite setbacks, ours in the long run is a progressive history. White was a master wordsmith, so too Lewis. Hoover was plenty good, all spoke the language of reform. Herbert Hoover was a progressive par excellence. Most do not know this. Progressives were reformers of various guises. Most wanted to extend opportunities to more denizens of the Republic, yet some advocated limiting rights. The latter opposed social and cultural changes they disapproved of. In that era, drinking, jazz, movies, and such were immoral. These controllers sought to restrict the influence and the votes of others, immigrants, Blacks, Jews, Catholics, women, poor whites, et al., not worthy of equal opportunity. Reformers numbered in the tens of millions, a majority of the population. Plenty were activists, others quieter but intent on change. The rising middle class was particularly active in reform. Business communities pursued their own interests, the working classes theirs. Immigrant societies, women's organizations, consumer advocates weighed in. African Americans organized, Southerners, Western interests, the industrial East. Farmers in all regions sought progress as they interpreted it. Some reformers held more conservative positions, some more liberal. All argued for reform, for the American promise. Herbert Hoover in 1928 was elected 31st president, one of the great landslides in American history. The campaign was a battle between two progressives. Hoover, within the Republican Party, was an outlier of sorts. The party, largely progressive in the early decades of the century, had in the 20s given way to its conservative wing, just as Democratic progressives lost their edge to conservatism. Republican presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, through the 20s, promoted business-weighted agendas. Reformers in both parties with limited leverage in Congress and state houses were able to enact selected elements of their agendas. By the late 20s, for all the purported success of business-allied administrations, and they could claim credit for delivering an unprecedented, prosperous decade, there remained substantial problems. The nation had been on a tear. Caveats arose. The Roaring Twenties needed to be tempered. Reform sentiment, again, was boisterous. Alfred Emanuel Smith, the Democratic governor of New York, as Herbert Clark Hoover, was all out for change. The country must satisfactorily ensure all get their fair shake. Historian Alan Lichtman sums up, quote, both candidates represented and defended the American dream of opportunity and mobility. Neither would use the government to redistribute wealth or power or to place much restraint on the activities of business. Both accepted the prevailing order of the 20s and sought only modifications to make it function more humanely and efficiently. The candidates agreed on the efficacy of electoral politics and the shared interests of all Americans. The 28 campaign at base was about quality of life. How does the country expand its middle class? Who gets in on the action? Progressives were enthusiastic. Millions rallied behind Smith. Millions backed Hoover. Radical journalist, and he was very radical, Lincoln Steffens was all in for Hoover. Quote, big business in America is producing what the socialists hold up as their goal. Food, shelter, and clothing for all. You will see it during the Hoover administration. While history is never fixed, we always can learn more. Historians home in on, for we never know all of the past, what occurred and why. Who are we? Where have we arrived? From where did we set out? Where do we head as a nation? As a cultural historian, I study, write, and teach from the perspective, who are we as a people? What makes us tick? I'm challenged by how we speak to one another. What's on people's minds? What values count most? What do we enjoy? What do we wish for ourselves in life, for our children, for our country? What are we willing to fight for? We is an all-encompassing word, of course. We know, too, we are a vast array of individuals, communities. These are all important words in our history. I specialize in consumerism in the commodification of American life. I study the growth of 20th century middle-class identity. I research monographs, biographies, journals. I analyze speeches, campaigns. I watch films, read newspapers, novels. I listen to music, study advertising. I mean, for me, it's a good gig. Changing beliefs prompt questions. I am partial to those who use words. I am partial to the tenet, words count. Early on in my education, I knew the Hoover basics, but had little sense of what a huge force for change he had been. Nor had I known he was a giant in the formation of public relations. I had absolutely no clue he was good with language, not bad as a speaker. To the contrary, I had been taught he was at bottom, and it cost him dearly, a lousy communicator. Hoover, in fact, was in his public heyday from 1913 into the first year and a half of his administration, considered a highly effective communicator, good at words, superb at public relations. He had a broad command of new technologies. He pioneered mass communications. The radio established the continental broadcasting breadth under his guidance. Its continental breadth. I was drawn to Hoover in graduate school, learning more of his story. Rags to riches, an orphan rises to international stature as the great engineer. He held a host of monikers. He was the great humanitarian, saving the lives of over 100 million civilians, principally in Europe, during and following World War I. He served Woodrow Wilson's war administration. He was nicknamed the Food Czar, organizing domestic and overseas production and distribution. To Hooverize, that is, to increase efficiency, was new to the popular lexicon, and it became part of the European lexicon. As Secretary of Commerce in the 20s, he brought about national standardization to productivity and consumption, standard sizing of clothing, measurements of lumber, tools, nuts and bolts. He advocated zoning regulation, housing expansion, building codes, and workplace regulations. Hoover oversaw the building of continental highways. 1928, his landslide into the presidency. 1932, his massive defeat and slide into ignominy. Here was a meteoric and a tragic American story. Few Americans know much at all, and much of what they know is errant about Hoover. This includes too many who study and teach history. This intrigued me. The general treatment runs, not much there to worry about. Hoover, not important, except for causing the Depression. Not so. Even those who closely study Hoover miss key aspects of his story. I was taken aback. Most are uninformed of his communication skills. They demonstrate no grasp of how well he knew his audiences. They fail to credit his ability to work the public. Hoover, after all, was regaled as the great communicator. Why do they short this great attribute? Few recognize his essential role establishing middle-class identity. Fortunately, a segment of historians arose in the last decades of the 20th century to reconsider Hoover. Revisionists produced studies highlighting what had been forgotten, arguing he had been misrepresented by the discipline and misunderstood by generations of Americans. I liked their work. Their takes were fresh. I opted to join their ranks, offering my cultural historian's take. Hoover trusted the American promise. Hoover, a multimillionaire, retired from engineering. He was a mining engineer, international mining engineer, and dedicated himself to public service in the years before the outbreak of war in Europe in 1913. He remained a public servant until his death at the age of 90 in 1964, still sharp as a tack. He kept engaged in politics. He became, in the middle and late stages of his life, a prolific writer on public affairs and policy. He published his rich 3-volume memoirs. Always current, Hoover spoke out. He wrote his own speeches. He did his research. Students of history, I recognized, ought to read more of Hoover and read his words. Let's do so. Get a better handle on Hoover's ideals, his accomplishments, his spirit. Hoover's campaign for the presidency was a public relations masterpiece. David Berner in Herbert Hoover, A Public Life, depicts the campaign launch in West Branch, Iowa. The staging was consummate. Quote, rain washed the landscape, its brilliance. Quote, it was a John Stuart Curry painting, the myth or reality of the garden. Quote, all this Hoover could add to his imposing modernity, his brilliance at engineering and his administrative skill. So much had happened in recent years, and here he's signaling Hoover's reign as Secretary of Commerce. Society was suffused with cars, radio, appliances, electricity, zeppelins, moving pictures. Berner writes, the Republican nominee demonstrated his command of America's image of itself, past, present, and future. He concludes in Hoover, as with pioneer aviator Charles Lindbergh, was seen a new age in old garments, an acceptable metaphor for change. We hold to past values, address present concerns, progress. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote one of the seminal New Deal histories. He addresses Hoover's work at Commerce and his early administration activity. No one ever considers Schlesinger a fan of Hoover. He was a bona fide Democrat, a bona fide New Dealer, but he knew what to admire. He observes Hoover in 1928 in a manner National Idol Lindbergh, he observes Hoover that he observes that Hoover in 1928 in a manner National Idol Lindbergh was not capable could, quote, satisfy the need for national leadership. Hoover, quote, could elicit the potentialities for spiritual good which people believed were locked away in the excitement of prosperity. Americans searched more than ever, writes Schlesinger, for the man who could transform the money madness into the benevolent order of service they dreamed of in their moments of exaltation. Hoover, he writes, offered the hopeful individualism of a cooperative future. We can indeed be a less selfish, more selfless people. Here, Hoover was a great national hero in the 1920s, and the fact that he spoke out for less selfishness, more selflessness was well known. The Progressive Era, the most consequential reform movement in all of American history, ran strong from the 1890s through World War I. It waned considerably in the 20s, and then it reemerged in the 30s. Ever since, progressivism has ebbed and flowed, leaving a lasting imprint on public policy, politics, society, economics, and culture. It represented a massive changing of the guard. Government had to play a bigger role in American life. Government had to work with citizens. All economic sectors, all interests, institutions, organizations. Hoover was one of the most effective leaders for change. Not all Republicans were with him. As Secretary of Commerce and as presidential candidate, he had severe critics. Conservatives were impatient with reform. Still, conservative icon Harding admired his secretary. Quote, the smartest gink I know. Ultra-conservative Coolidge did not. Quote, that man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad. Yet Coolidge often had to bend to the popular Hoover. Harding allowed his secretary range to build commerce from a backwater department into the most powerful cabinet position, Hoover had his fingers in fellow cabinet members' business, all of them. His power was only surpassed by the presidents themselves. The Des Moines Register's Pulitzer Prize cartoonist, J.N. Ding Darling, admired his fellow Iowan. In 1927, he pictured in a cartoon the traffic problem in Washington, D.C. Ding features a pack of Hoovers stampeding across a jam of cabinet secretaries, congressmen, and government sycophants. Each Hoover sports a hat. One banner's radio, another unemployment. There he is, foreign debt commissioner. There he is, farm economist, labor arbitrator. Here's the man in charge of exports, aviation, shipping, and child hygiene. Joan Hoff Wilson in Herbert Hoover, Forgotten Progressives, observes Coolidge, quote, resented what he called the Wonder Boys spendthrift programs. In the memoirs, Hoover made short shrift of Harding and Coolidge. His heroes were progressive titans Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Hoover desponds in the memoirs. Monsieurs Harding and Coolidge were ultra-conservative as to federal expenditures. The 28 campaign had been premised on change. Middle-class standing was at issue. Well, the Wonder Boy, with his spendthrift habit, now held the keys to the Treasury. Humorist Will Rogers caught the drift. Prosperity, millions never had it under Coolidge, never had it under anybody, but expect it under Hoover. Hoover, throughout his memoirs, draws on his vast store of speeches. At Palo Alto, accepting the party nomination, he trumpeted, quote, it is not through the recitation of wise policies in government alone that we demonstrate our progress under Republican guidance. Going on, to me, the test is the security, comfort, and opportunity that have been brought to the average American family. He rattles off statistics, but they're not boring. The audience knows exactly what he's getting at. During this less than 8 year, he writes, during this less than 8 years, our population has increased by 8%. Yet our national income has increased by over $30 billion per year, or more than 45%. Our production, and therefore our consumption of goods, has increased by over 25%. It is easily demonstrated that these increases have been widely spread among our whole people. Then he goes on, home ownership has grown. Well, during this period, the number of families has increased by about 2,300,000. We have built more than 3,500,000 new and better homes. In this short time, he continues, we have equipped nearly 9 million more homes with electricity. And through it, drudgery has been lifted from the lives of women. Not incidentally, his wife was a very strong reformer, a very strong feminist, a very strong progressive, Lou Hoover. You ought to read about her. The barriers of time and distance, he goes on, have been swept away and life made freer and larger by the installation of 6 million more telephones, 7 million radio sets. Cities, he argues, are growing magnificent with beautiful buildings, parks, and playgrounds. He doesn't have to convince anybody. He continues, 14 million more motor cars ride newly laid splendid roads. That traffic jam that Ding pictured in Washington, traffic jams were a huge issue across the country. Hoover never gloats. He always takes pride. That sunny day in California, 70,000 crowded into Stanford University's football stadium. Over the airwaves, millions took note. Hoover goes on. Most of all, I like to remember what this progress has meant to America's children. The portal of their opportunity has been ever widening. Population, he reminds the listeners, has grown by 8%. The children in grade schools is up by 11%, in high schools by 66%, and 75% in higher learning. Again, women were rushing into higher learning. They were outnumbering the men in colleges and universities. Hoover continues, nor have people been selfish. He reminds them that savings have doubled. Neighbors, he says, have met with a full hand the most sacred obligations of man and woman, but it was a different time. Charity. The gifts of America to churches, to hospitals, to institutions for the care of the afflicted, and to relief from great disasters have surpassed by hundreds of millions any totals for any similar period in all human record. Hoover knows the audience, appreciates the gains. He appreciates the gains too, but Hoover knows the audience, appreciates the gains, hugs the stats. He takes to the hustings to tell the story, delivering lengthy, targeted speeches to regional audiences. His words carry across the national broadcasting system that he built. He speaks forwardly of the nation, its promise, and he serves up numbers, policies, promise. The message is clear. At Palo Alto, he concluded, this is really important, listen. Economic advancement is not an end in itself. Successful democracy rests wholly upon the moral and spiritual quality of its people. Our growth in spiritual achievements must keep pace with our growth in physical accomplishments. Material prosperity, he states, and moral progress must march together. Our government, to match the expectations of our people, must have constant regard for those human values that give dignity and nobility to life. He concludes, size, wealth, and power alone cannot fulfill the promise of America's opportunity. Hoover was a devotee of what he coined American individualism. Scholar Ellis Hawley, recently deceased University of Iowa Professor of History Emeritus, and a huge Hoover scholar, cites before the presidency, Hoover had risen to be the nation's leading spokesman for what he felt to be a new and superior form of self-government. And this is what he says more. In America's burgeoning network of self-governing associations, and he's talking about is farmers, women, immigrants, business, consumer advocates, and a host of others, goes on, he had come to believe lay the nucleus of an ideal regulatory structure, one that could bring order, efficiency, and equity without producing industrial dictatorships, closed cartels, or stultifying bureaucracies. Led by enlightened and public-spirited men, these cooperative institutions could develop codes of ethical behavior, desirable patterns of social obligations, and the harmonious productivity of which an integrated and purposeful commonwealth was capable. A grand middle-class option, in short, is what Hawley's talking about, was attainable. That was what the progressives always had in their sights. Hoover trusted in individualism, community, and good governance. Hawley writes, quote, he believed that his earlier activities had done much to preserve the aims of the founders. Traditional liberties in the complex 20th century could stand. They could remedy social ills, raise living standards, and achieve stable employment and profit. Hawley concludes, quote, the vision has remained an influential component to how we govern ourselves to this day. Progress, new measures meet new challenges. First there's progress, it's made up of new measures, and then arise new challenges. There are indeed periods of retrenchment, rethinking, elimination of unnecessary or problem policies. Then again, the wheel turns. We move from liberal eras to more conservative eras, but progressivism remains part of who we are as a people. The wheel turns, experimentation, the promise holds, individuals and communities count. Again, the progressive mantra. The Secretary of Commerce wrote a book, American Individualism. It's a brief treatise, and it was published in 1922. Some Hoover historians dismiss it for fuzzy thinking, poor writing. These revisionists, the later revisionists are mistaken when they take up this point. Hoover is not fuzzy. Hoover does not write poorly. Closer reading, context is in order. The New York Times in 1922 had another take, declaring the work, quote, among the few great formulations of American political theory. Of course, this is a paper of note. It bears the same relation to the problems of the present and the future that the essays of Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and Noah Webster bore to the problems that occupied men's minds when the Constitution was framed. Again, New York Times. Well, in fact, the work is a sort of rough-hewn philosophy, hardly the Federalist Papers. However, it remains a relevant and a good read. William Allen White, 2 months into the Hoover presidency and a huge reformer, progressive, wrote in Public Affairs magazine, "We have ceased to mark time. New blood and leadership enter with Hoover." And it's a huge piece. Through the Commerce years, the Secretary's modus operandi was to draw together the best and brightest to chart out an agenda for change. Former Hoover Presidential Center Director Richard Norton Smith writes Hoover's third way, not too far to the left, not too far to the right, rather right down the middle, the American way, was what it was all about. Quote, true to his instincts, Hoover's first months in office were a whirlwind of reform, he writes. He stretched his hand out to all. He expanded protection against unfair treatment of federal civil service workers. He canceled private oil leases on government lands, halted the corruption that haunted the Harding administration. And let's be straight. No one ever charged Hoover with corruption. If anything, he was the clean gene of the era, certainly of the Harding administration. He set out to gather information for a reorganization of the government's 10 major departments in that first 6 months. He moved to form a committee examining social trends. Planning for the future, writes Smith, was a Hoover fetish. Plans for a series of dams in Tennessee and California were launched. The president drew together a citizens committee to consider establishing a Department of Education. He sought the advice of insurance brass regarding devising old age pensions. The president intended, this is Herbert Hoover, to disperse $50 a month to those over 65. Hoover was a progressive. He urged Congress to set up a federal power commission, supply subsidies to county health units, build a rural child health program, reform railroad rates, banking. The White House on its own went about establishing a $5 billion program to address mistreatment in federal prisons and reform rehabilitation programs. And there was plenty more. Donald McCoy recalls the run-up to the 28 election. Hoover earned the reputation of being an innovative and productive public servant. And Hoover, along with many other Americans, thought that he was just the man to make the most intelligent use of knowledge and technology to combat society's problems for the good of all. In the memoirs, Hoover spells out all his administration set out to change. He was confronted 6 months into his term by a catastrophic collapse of the national economy. His compassionate ambitions to build and spread the nation's wealth, to ensure opportunity for all, had to be severely drawn back. The Great Depression had to be harnessed. Yet where he could, he tried to keep moving forward. Hoover, throughout the Commerce years, organized over 3,000 conferences. This is him speaking. I did not believe in haphazard public conferences. Hoover naturally had his faults. We all do. But being haphazard was never a Hoover descriptive. Far in advance, he would draw together representatives of specific interests, community leaders, and experts to sit on program committees. They were divided into groups. They issued reports on segments of the problem at hand. Then later conferees met together. He continued the practice, endless conferences once in office. I end this talk, I'm looking over at the clock, highlighting the section in Hoover's memoirs wherein he recalls the heady days of spring and summer 1929, the first 6 months of his administration. He writes, "I am well aware that uninformed persons recollect my term as president solely as the period of the Great Depression. He wishes to clarify. He covers all the actions, programs, plans he had initiated in those first 6 months. He sets forth in a discussion entitled Development and Reform what had been his agenda during that half year, how so much more might have been accomplished in the long run. In a subsection, he reviews the development of child welfare, compassion, efficiency, a call to arms for the public good. He is speaking now, we have to recall, a century ago. The promises he addresses resonate strongly today. Here, Hoover, the young always topped his agenda. His tough childhood benefited from the assistance of individuals and communities. The idea he was a mossback is ludicrous. Think about what he was proposing. The government, he writes, had a key role to play. Quote, in accord with my policy of first determining the facts and at the same time creating public understanding, I invited delegates to form a program committee. The president himself raised $500,000 from private resources to pay expenses and meet the cost of publications. This is in the bountiful first months in the White House. The conference convened November 1930. The nation now sunk deep into economic malaise. Over 1,200 delegates from across the United States, representing public and private institutions, had reviewed data on the problems which these are Hoover's words, problems which ranged over every phase of child life. The president welcomed the assembly to Washington. Quote, I am satisfied that your conference here will result in benefits which will be felt for a full generation. The conferees, he made clear, spoke to and for the country. Quote, I am mindful also of the unseen millions listening, of course, on the newly established by Hoover National Radio Network, who likewise are truly members of this conference. For these problems are theirs. It is their children. Quote, let no one believe these are questions which should not stir a nation, that they are below the dignity of statesmen or governments. If we could have but one generation of properly born, trained, educated, and healthy children, 1,000 other problems of government would vanish. Moreover, one good nurse will save a dozen future policemen. Think, he proposes, what generations can accomplish. Hoover cuts to the chase. He recalls for the conference the array of disheartening statistics before them. Now, it's important, keep in mind the words he uses to describe people in need are from another era. This was a day that referred to the crippled, to retarded, to the deficients. This in no way undercuts the compassion, the determination to fulfill the nation's promise. We are, Hoover emphasizes, 100 million Americans. Amongst us, he tells the conferees, are 6 million undernourished children, 1 million with speech defects, another million with heart problems, 675,000 with behavior problems, 450,000 mentally retarded, and 382,000 who are tubercular. Add in, he says, 342,000 with impaired hearing, 18,000 totally deaf, 300,000 crippled, 50,000 partially blind, 14,000 fully so, 200,000 recorded delinquent, and 500,000 dependent. he alerts the attendants and the national radio audience of 10,000 deficients amongst us. Probably 3 million of these children were not receiving the necessary attention, though our knowledge and experience showed that these deficiencies could be prevented and remedied. Hoover extols, quote, "Let us bear in mind that there are 35 million reasonably normal, cheerful human electrons radiating joy and mischief and hope and faith. Vivid, romping, everyday children, our own and our neighbors, with all their strongly marked differences, and the more differences, the better. The more they charge us with their separate problems, the more we know they are vitally and humanly alive. Quote, there are 1,500,000 specially gifted children. There lies the future leadership of the nation if we devote ourselves to their guidance." He says that the knowledge and experience of the conferees is unprecedented. Quote, "It will rest with you to light the fires of that inspiration in the general public conscience, and from conscience lead it into action. Action now. Build up and out that broad middle-class constituency, individualism and community and government." PR-savvy Hoover elaborates in the memoirs, quote, "I felt that the reports, owing to their technical character, would not develop popular understanding or make that impression on the country at large which I sought as a support to official action. Working with Dr. Wilbur, who's Secretary of Interior, chair of the conference, public health spokesperson, quote, I revised, and it was mainly him, I revised what I had some years before stated as the Children's Charter, and the conference adopted it. Several million copies forthwith were broadsided out across the country. The updated Children's Charter encapsulated his ambition to launch a robust era of child reform. The president recalls, quote, while in the White House, I carried on the work of the American Child Health Association, which I had founded 10 years before as Secretary of Commerce. The revised charter consists of 19 separate charges. The document was and remains a remarkable single-page broadside, and you could find it on the internet. The Children's Charter commences with overarching admonitions. Quote, for every child, spiritual and moral training to help him to stand firm under the pressure of life. For every child, a home and that love and security which a home provides, and for that child who must receive foster care, the nearest substitute for his own home. The third and fifth charges are riveting. Quote, for every child, full preparation for his birth, his mother receiving prenatal and postnatal care, and the establishment of such protective measures as will make childbearing safer. Further, quote, for every child health care from birth through adolescence, including periodical health examinations and where needed care of specialists and hospital treatment, regular dental exams and care of the teeth, protective and preventive measures against communicable diseases, the ensuring of pure food, pure milk, and pure water. The propositions roll forth: health education, recreation opportunities, home environments, safe and sanitary home environments, modern schools, safe, sanitary. For the youngest, nursery schools and kindergartens to supplement home care. Planned communities to meet the play, recreational, and health needs of the children. For all the children, such teaching and training as will prepare him or her for successful parenthood, homemaking, and the rights of citizenship. And for parents, supplementary training to fit them to deal wisely with the problems of parenthood. The charter aims to ward off workplace hazards, maiming and deaths of children and parents, a huge progressive issue. And, quote, For every child who is blind, deaf, crippled, or otherwise handicapped, and for the child who is mentally handicapped, research, medical care, training. Expenses of these services should be borne publicly where they cannot be privately met. Delinquents must be treated, quote, intelligently as society's charge, not society's outcast. And children cannot be relegated to labor, stunted physically or mentally, deprived of their education. And for the rural child, quote, a satisfactory schooling and health services as for the city child, and an extension to rural families of social, recreational, and cultural facilities. The final 19th charge, quote, to make everywhere available these minimum protections of the health and welfare of children, there should be a district, county, or community organization for health, education, and welfare with full-time officials coordinating with Level Up, a statewide program, which will be responsible to a nationwide service of general information, statistics, and scientific research. This should include A, trained full-time public health officials with public health nurses, sanitary inspection and laboratory workers. B, available hospital beds. C, full-time public welfare service for the relief, aid, and guidance of children in special need due to poverty, misfortune, or behavior difficulties, and for the protection of children from abuse, neglect, exploitation, or moral hazard. Back up a bit, the 15th charge. He admonishes, quote, and this is so important, for every child, the right to grow up in a family with an adequate standard of living and the security of a stable income as the surest safeguard against social handicaps. Middle-class America. The Children's Charter, I put in middle-class America. The Children's Charter underscores was at stake at the end with a bold-faced dedication in capital letters. Again, listen. For every child, these rights, regardless of race or color or situation, wherever he may live under the protection of the American flag. In conclusion, for half a century, historians have revised their takes on Hoover. For all that, he always will remain, as Joan Hoff Wilson argues, the forgotten progressive. Articles, monographs, biographies abound, but most historians do not read them or take serious note unless focusing on a particular angle of history touching on Hoover. In lectures, professors, not all of course, but they do gloss over and misrepresent him. Textbooks give him short shrift. There has been, over the past 50 years, improvement in how Hoover is treated, thanks to the revisionists. But truth be told, he was president almost 100 years ago. The mold has been set. Still, for those who want to know the full story, there's more to learn of him and our country, ourselves. Herbert Clark Hoover was a good man. Read about him. Read him. Heck, tell your neighbors. Hoover was a progressive. Thank you for listening, and I guess we'll have a discussion now. Yes?
Okay.
Hello?
Thank you for that. So I guess, the main question that's come in is, why do historians continue to dismiss Hoover when his record proves his ideas were powerful and attractive to many ideas currently before us? It seems that the historians that have studied him have been making this argument that, he needs to be revisited. His reputation needs to be re-examined and perhaps lifted up more. But yet, every time we see these polls by historians, Hoover's always in the bottom third.
Well, Well, I mean, you're right, Tom, and that's what I was trying to say at the end. I hope the comment came in before my last paragraph, but it's been 100 years and the mold is set. And, when I'd teach, and I'd teach Hoover, and others who would teach Hoover, the accurate Hoover, we teach these to students in education programs. We teach them to those going on into graduate programs, those going on into history. But there's just an awful lot of history to study. There's lots of angles. And, there's Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's never shorted. It's just the spoils of history, I guess, for those involved in a way. There's no question amongst the historians who study the early 20th century, they pick up, I mean, certainly those who have masters and PhDs, they pick up more on Hoover. But on the other hand, really, most historians just don't. And even those who study the 20s and 30s, they're not necessarily interested in Hoover, and they've been long molded themselves to simply discount him. It's really tragic. Sorry, lengthy answer. I'm an educator. I'm a teacher.
Yeah, it has always struck me as odd, though, that so-called presidential historians, for most presidents, and it's particularly true of modern presidents and those that have presidential libraries, the presidency is the pinnacle of all of their careers, except for Hoover. Hoover's major accomplishments occur before and after the presidency. In fact,
Yes.
Hoover kind of defines what a former president ought to do in terms of assisting the office holder. I mean, what he did for Harry Truman, what he did for President Eisenhower.
Yes.
Even President Kennedy reached out to him.
Oh, absolutely.
And he said, I'm too old. I want to finish some projects. But it really is an unusual trajectory and an unusual presidency. Because even though most people think of Hoover as a failed president because of the Depression, many of the things you pointed out, his accomplishments in reforming courts and prisons, that occurs during his presidency. I mean, he used the power of the federal government to put Al Capone in jail, which is what most people might know in terms of his reforms in criminal justice. But it does seem very curious that people again are so dismissive of Hoover when he probably founded what is now the model for humanitarian treatment during war and in post-war situations. He mentored a whole generation of leaders who would take on what we now call non-governmental organizations, UNICEF. We had a previous speaker talk about Maurice Pate. And so I don't know how you get the word out.
Well, you're working at it. Aaron's working at it. I'm working at it. I think it's just what I said. I mean, truth be told, it's just not going to become widespread. Interestingly enough, there is a more recent example of the same thing happening. And in fact, as you were speaking about how Hoover's, really set the template for former presidents, which most have not done all the sorts of things that he did. But Jimmy Carter, they always say, set the template, but actually, for that matter, Lou Hoover was a very active first lady, okay? But the wash of history is such, the tides of history, just, Carter Carter, in the long run, is going to be mainly known for his post-presidency. He too will be, and generally is given short shrift. I mean, here we are, was it 40 years later since Carter was president? Amazing he's still going. And most people are incredibly dismissive of Carter, but there's some revisionist work going on. Listen, I'm curious about it too. That's why it all intrigued me. And so all I can say is keep up the fight.
So as a social historian, I've always been struck at how the Hoovers were very much involved with the cultural currents of their time.
Yes.
They loved motion pictures. They set up movie night at the White House and the theater in the White House. They were very much interested in what was happening not only in film, but on Broadway and in theaters. They read novels that
were incredibly well-read, educated people too.
But they also both enjoyed reading detective stories, and
keep a balance.
Not only American authors, but British authors who, of course, were very adept at writing manor mysteries. Can you talk a little bit more about these cultural influences that may have impacted both Lou and Herbert Hoover?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were in the first graduating class of Stanford, and little college then, but they matured in the progressive reform era. They were highly educated, highly engaged, and whatever was happening, they would be aware of and they would indulge in and all. They were global travelers. I mean, his career as an mining engineer overseas, I mean, they traveled with their children for a long time, 2 sons. Later, they were in, private schools, I believe, as they got older, were left behind. But the family traveled all over, and you could be sure went to they tried to drink up all the culture that they could. These were people who, Hoover was an outdoorsman. He was a great fisherman, okay? But more than that, I mean, Hoover and Lou and Herbert Hoover, they knew guns. When the Boxer Rebellion arose in China, they manned and womaned the barricades, okay? They were constantly engaged. Lou Hoover is incredibly important in the history of the Girl Scouts of America and all. Lou Hoover was active in so many ways as a first lady. The Hoovers in the war administration and in the 20s were close friends with the Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and all. And so these were the sorts of people that they hung around with. The fact that they were so familiar with their culture, in part, is due to the fact that they were progressives. They were looking forward. And Hoover loved things like, radios, and, he was a bridge builder into the 20th century.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour.
Have we?
But
all right.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Just to remind everyone, this has been recorded, and this will go on the Library Museum's YouTube channel. So hoover.archives.gov, and it'll be posted probably early next week.
Well, that's excellent. Again, Tom, I want to thank you and however many listeners we've had. One right at the end, when the discussion started, was my niece's husband. I saw he left. It said. So I'm going to get a hold of him immediately. But really, thanks to everybody. This was a great honor. I appreciate it.
Okay, and thanks to everyone who's been tuning in to the Third Thursdays. And again, previous programs are archived on the Hoover Presidential Foundation website. This one will be on the Library Museum website. So thank you for joining us, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you.